Well, good morning, church. How are we doing? Good. That was kind of weak. Can we do it again? How are we doing? There we go. That's better. Well, it's good to be with you guys. Today we are continuing on in our Living the Way of Jesus series. We're actually closing it today, so I'm excited for that. But over the last few weeks, right, we've been talking about what it actually means to live the way of Jesus, right? Oftentimes we can make following Jesus more complicated than I think he really intended it to be for us. We can oftentimes find ourselves adding extra biblical things to our relationship with him that he never asked us to do or expected. Jesus didn't walk up to people and give them a 10-step plan, right, for becoming a Christian. He often just said two very simple words, which are, follow me. And that is what we've really been unpacking together in this series. What does it actually look like to follow Jesus and to live the way of Jesus in our everyday life? The first week that we started this series, we talked about being with Jesus, right? We looked at Mary, who sat at the feet of Jesus and was just simply spending time in his presence, slowing down enough to actually be present with him. And before we can live like Jesus, we have to actually spend time with Jesus. The second week, we talked about Sabbath and resting. Right, we looked at the rhythms of Jesus that he actually established and how Jesus wasn't constantly just rushing from one thing to the next, but that he made space to get away. He made space to retreat and to spend time with the Lord. He made space to rest. And we talked about how important it is for us to develop those same rhythms in our own lives. And I posed the question, right, are you actually resting or are you just recovering? The third week, we talked about the idea that they have been with Jesus, right? The religious leaders, they looked at Peter and John and they knew that these men were not highly educated. They were not impressive by worldly standards, but there was something different about them. They could tell that these guys had been with Jesus. Then last week we talked about community. Last week we launched our community groups and we talked about the reason why we need each other in our own lives and why following Jesus was really never meant to be something that we just did alone. We need people to come alongside us to encourage us, to pray with us, to challenge us, to love us, and to walk with us through everyday life, because the way of Jesus is something that we really do learn to walk together in. And as we've walked through these weeks, right, we've talked about being with Jesus, spending time with him, about resting, the importance of that, becoming like Jesus, and then following Jesus together. But today I want to really bring all of that together with a question. What happens when following Jesus actually costs us something? It's easy to follow Jesus, right, when his ways line up with our ways. But what happens when Jesus asks us to surrender something that we just simply don't want to surrender? What happens when his way is harder than we thought our own way would be? And that's where we're going to find ourselves today. If you have a copy of God's Word, I want to invite you to turn to Matthew chapter 16. And we're going to see here that Jesus is going to tell his disciples, and he's going to tell us what it really means to follow him. One of the verses says, if anyone wants to follow after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. And I think that's really a great way for us to close the series this morning, because living the way of Jesus isn't simply just about learning his rhythms or admiring his life. It's ultimately about deciding that his way is going to become our way. And so let's look at what Jesus has to teach us this morning in Matthew chapter 16, beginning in verse 24. It says this, then Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone wants to follow after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life because of me will find it. For what will it benefit someone if he gains the whole world, yet loses his life? Or what will anyone give in exchange for his life? For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will reward each according to what he has done. Truly, I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Thank you for reading the word of the Lord with me this morning. We see here in Matthew chapter 16, before what we just read, Jesus is interacting here with religious leaders. And then he takes his disciples away. And as the chapter goes on, the focus really here begins to shift towards one big question. And that's, who is Jesus? Who is Jesus really? And Jesus eventually asks his disciples in Matthew chapter 16, verse 13, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they give various answers, right? Maybe John the Baptist, Jeremiah, one of the prophets. And then Jesus, though, takes it a step further and he makes it personal. But who do you say that I am? And then we see Peter says, well, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Peter here, he's right. Obviously, he understands that Jesus isn't just simply another prophet. He's not just a regular teacher, but that Jesus here is really the promised Messiah. Jesus then tells Peter that this understanding of him didn't come basically from himself. It didn't come from human wisdom. Rather, it came from the Father. Jesus begins to tell the disciples what being the Messiah actually means, though. Matthew chapter 16, verse 21 says, "From then on, Jesus began to point out to his disciples that it was necessary for him to go to Jerusalem, suffer many things from the elders, chiefs, priests, and scribes, be killed, and be raised the third day." And this really here is the first time in Matthew that Jesus begins to clearly explain to his disciples that, hey, the cross is coming. The cross is coming. But Peter, he hears this and he kind of has a problem with this. Peter, right, he just confessed, Jesus, you are the Christ. And Peter, though, is thinking that Messiah means victory, a kingdom, power, right? That Israel's enemies are going to be defeated. But Jesus says to him, But Jesus says Messiah actually equals suffering, right? It actually means that Jesus is going to be rejected and that he's ultimately going to be crucified. And here Peter is struggling to reconcile those two things. We see in Matthew chapter 16, verse 22, it says, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Oh no, Lord, this will never happen to you." And Peter is essentially saying to Jesus, right, that's not how this thing is supposed to happen. And then we see Jesus come against Peter in a very strong rebuke, and he says, "Get behind me, Satan." Right? That's a pretty shocking thing for you to hear and to be rebuked by. And Jesus isn't saying that Peter himself, right, is Satan, but he's recognizing that Peter's words are trying to pull Jesus away from the Father's mission. Peter here, he wants Jesus to win, but he doesn't understand that Jesus' victory is going to come through the cross. Okay? And so after correcting Peter, Jesus says, if anyone wants to follow me, and that's what we just read, and so this is where we're going to begin this morning in verse 24. Jesus here, he's correcting Peter about what we just talked about. He is saying, Peter, you don't understand the way of the Messiah, and you really don't understand the way of a disciple either. If Jesus' way leads to the cross, then following Jesus for us means that we're going to have to embrace the way of the cross too. And that's why verse 24 makes so much more sense when we break it down in the context that we find it. Right? Jesus isn't randomly just introducing a difficult teaching here. He's responding to Peter's misunderstanding of what it means to really be Jesus, to be the Messiah. Peter wants Jesus to be the Messiah, but without the cross that requires that. And I think sometimes we want to be Christians too, without the reality that that requires us to lay down our own lives and to carry our own cross. But Jesus says, if you want to follow me, take up your cross. And that's why this passage is such a good ending to living the way of Jesus. This entire series isn't just learning about a few nice things that Jesus has done. It's all about following where Jesus ultimately is leading. And sometimes where he leads, right, it can be uncomfortable for us. It can be sacrificial. It can require us laying things down. It can be difficult. It can be, sometimes we have to lay down aside our preferences. We have to say, hey, my plans are not better than your plans. We have to lay down and surrender our pride, and we have to let go of the big control that we want to have. And there's an important connection worth pointing out here that Peter says, "You are the Christ." And then Jesus says, "If anyone would come after me." There's a progression here, right? Who is Jesus? Well, he's the Christ, which leads to what has Jesus come to do? And that leads, Jesus is going to the cross for our sin. And the progression continues, right? What does that mean then for us to follow him? And ultimately, it leads us to us taking up our own cross and following him completely. And so the cross, right, it isn't just some unfortunate detour. It was the plan all along. It's central to the mission of Jesus, and it's central really for us to understand what true discipleship actually means. Verse 24 is Jesus telling his disciples, if you want to follow me, this is what it's going to require of you, and this is what it's going to look like. Right? Jesus here, he isn't hiding the cost of discipleship. He's telling them straight up, basically, let you deny yourself. And when Jesus says deny yourself, he isn't saying to us that, hey, you can't enjoy life, that you can't have dreams that you aspire to, or that you're just to neglect yourself, right? He's talking about the act of surrendering your own life to him. And it really is a change of question from what do I want? And it's requiring us to begin to ask a question, Jesus, what do you want? Instead of what do I want, Jesus, what do you want? Instead of asking ourselves what's best for me, we begin to ask Jesus, what is your will for my life? And this really connects to what we've talked about this entire series. We've talked about sitting at the feet of Jesus. And when we did that, we were learning to slow down enough to listen to his voice. When we talked about the Sabbath, we were learning to trust Jesus enough for us to actually stop and to slow down. When we talked about community, we were learning that following Jesus isn't just about obeying something by ourselves. When we talked about recognizing Jesus in each other, right? We were talking about how Jesus really changes us from the inside out and about how Jesus changes the way that we live. And all of that, all that I just talked about, ultimately starts with surrender. It says, take up his cross, right? This sounds much more familiar to us today, even though I still don't think that we do a very good job of understanding it. But the cross is much more familiar to us today than it was back in that time and in this context. Because for us, the cross is familiar, right? We wear crosses around our necks. We have crosses in our churches. We have crosses on the walls in our houses. We sing about the cross. But for the disciples here, the cross represented death. It represented execution. It represented suffering. And so when Jesus tells them that you are going to have to take up your cross, he's ultimately talking to them and to us about how we are going to have to die to ourselves. How we're going to have to die to ourselves, and that's a daily thing. It's not just a once, we do it once and we're good. Like, that is a thing that we have to continually do when we wake up. We have to say that your ways are better than my ways, and we have to die to ourselves. And so Jesus is saying that following him is going to cost you something. And then what we see him say next is, follow me. To follow me. And that's the key, right? We're laying things down because Jesus is worth following. And so a point that I want to make this morning is that we have to surrender our way. We need to surrender our way. Living the way of Jesus really starts with recognizing, hey, my way is not always the best way. And that can be hard for us to come to the realization of that because we like control, right? We don't like giving up control. We want to hold everything super, super tightly, and we want to make sure that we control everything. We want to make sure that we're in charge of our own plans, right? We want to know what's coming. We want something predictable. We don't want to have surprises. But Jesus here is saying, deny yourself. Deny yourself. And a question I want to pose to us this morning, is there an area where you're still saying, Jesus, I'll follow you anywhere except this little area? And we hold on to it tightly. Is there any area in your life that you're telling Jesus, I'll follow you anywhere except for this area? Because that's what Jesus is inviting us all into today. It's all surrendering things to Him. And we see next in verse 25 what happens when we really do surrender. It says, "For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life because of me will find it." And this is one of those statements from Jesus that can seem sort of backwards, right? Because culture kind of tells us the opposite thing, right? Culture tells us to protect ourselves. Culture tells us to look out for your own interests. Build your own life. Do your own thing. Do what makes you happy, right? But Jesus is saying, whoever would save his life will lose it. You see, church, you can spend your whole life trying to protect your life and still miss the God who created that life for you. But then we see that Jesus says, whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. And that's the paradox of the kingdom, right? The way to find your life is to actually surrender your life. And Jesus knows that the life that we try to build for ourselves will never satisfy us like the life He has that He wants you to walk in. And think about it, right? We chase success because we think success will somehow satisfy the deepest need in us. We chase money because we think that that will bring security and comfort to us. We chase that comfort because we think then that will give us peace, right? It's a spiraling thing. We chase recognition because we think that will help us become more noticeable and will in turn make us more valuable. But Jesus says, lose your life for my sake and you will find it. It's like Jesus is saying, stop spending your life trying to build a life that only I can give you. And then Jesus takes it even a step further in verse 26. He says, for what will it benefit someone if he gains the world yet loses his life? Or what will anyone give in exchange for his life? Right? If you actually do get that success that you're chasing here on earth, if you get the recognition, if you get the money, if you receive the status or the power, was it worth it if along the way you actually lost your soul? And this is such a searching question for us today that Jesus is asking the disciples and is asking us right here, right? Something important to notice also is that Jesus, He doesn't say what it will cost you. He says, what will it benefit you or what will it profit you? He's talking about the value of it. What is actually worth something, right? You could gain everything in this world, everything that it has to offer, yet you could still lose what matters most. You could have that career that you've been chasing, but somewhere along the way that cost you your family. You could have the money, right? You can chase the job that gives you the money, but guess what? Along the way, you've lost your peace. You could have the platform that you so desperately want, but you lose your character in it. You could have the success, right? But you could lose your soul along the way. And Jesus here is posing the question, what good is that? What good is that? And living the way of Jesus, it really challenges the way that our culture operates. It challenges the way that our culture thinks. It challenges the way that our culture presents everything to us. Because the reality is we can be very successful people and we can still be spiritually empty. We can have full calendars, but we can have empty souls. You could have all that you wanted here on earth and still be missing what matters most. And so a point I want to make this morning is that we just need to choose His way. Choose His way. Jesus here is putting two ways in front of us. It's our way or His way. And Jesus says that if we spend our lives trying to preserve our own way, that we may actually lose our own life. But, the good news, if we're willing to surrender our way to Him and follow Him, that's where we find real life. And that's what we've been talking about throughout this entire series. The way of Jesus isn't just a list of practices, it's a different way of living. It's a different way of thinking. It's a different way of seeing people, of loving people, of using our time, our money, our resources. It's a different way of resting in Him, right? It's a different way of working. The list could go on and on. It's a different way of living life. And Jesus is asking, will you choose my way? Verse 27 is just Jesus reminding that our current circumstances isn't the end of the story. It says, "For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels and the glory of his Father, and then he will reward each according to what he has done." The reality is, following Jesus is going to cost you something. But Jesus is coming in glory, it says. There is a day coming, right, when Jesus is going to make everything right. But it will cost you. Obedience, it'll cost you. Doing the right thing sometimes can make you look foolish to others, right? Sometimes that integrity, it'll cost you a job opportunity. Sometimes following Jesus means saying no to something that everyone else around you is saying yes to. But Jesus is saying, hey, don't lose sight of the reality that more is coming. Jesus is coming in glory, and because of that, following him is worth it. And then Jesus says, and then he will reward each according to what he has done. He will reward each according to what he has done. I think it's worth pointing out that he is the one that does the rewarding, nobody else. He is the one that does the rewarding. And this is about Jesus, right, returning as the king and setting all things right. And he's reminding the disciples that what we do with our lives matter. What we do with our lives matter. How we spend our lives matter. How we interact with people matter. How we love people matter, because ultimately our lives are accountable to him. And this should be really sobering for us. This should be a sobering thought, because we live in a world where a lot of things seem unfair. A lot of things are unfair. And right, sometimes we can see that the most dishonest person always somehow seems to get ahead. Or sometimes we do the right thing, but nobody ever notices that. Right? Sometimes people who are faithful, they suffer, while people who seem to not care about God at all are prospering. But Jesus is saying, there is coming a day when I will make all things right. Right? We may not see the reward of our faithfulness today, but I just want to let you know that God sees you in your faithfulness. And Jesus says to each person, right? Jesus isn't saying that he'll repay the people with the biggest platform. He's not saying that he'll repay the ones with the biggest accomplishments. He says each person, and God sees your individual faithfulness. The things that seem small to us sometimes aren't necessarily small to God, right? The parent who just faithfully loves their children, or the person who quietly serves in their church, or the person who gives generously when no one knows about it, right? The person that doesn't stop praying, the person that chooses obedience when it costs them something. And I just want you to hear me say today, God sees you in your faithfulness. He sees that. There are things that you do for Jesus that nobody will ever see, but God sees it. He sees your faithfulness. And then Jesus says, according to what he has done, he will reward them. Right? This can sometimes be confusing with our salvation maybe being based on works, and that's not here what Jesus is saying at all. The rest of the New Testament, right, is very clear that salvation is a gift of God's grace to us received through faith, and it's not something that we could ever earn. And so if it's not that, right, then what is Jesus saying? He is saying that our actions reveal what we actually believe and who we actually belong to. Our works don't earn salvation, but rather our works reveal our faith. And Jesus is saying that your life, it matters. The way that you live your life matters. How you love matters. How you treat people, it matters. And to use your time wisely. It's not that we are trying to earn God's love, right? But because you've already been loved by God, and that love begins really to change the way that you live. And we don't obey to be loved. We obey because we are loved. And we don't live the way of Jesus so that God will finally accept us. We live the way of Jesus because he has already accepted us. Right? You may hear he will reward each person according to what he does, and you might feel it, that feels like a threat. But I just want you to know, for a faithful follower of Jesus, it really should be received as an encouragement. Because God sees what nobody else sees. Your Father sees what is done in secret. And Jesus is reminding us that faithfulness is never wasted. And then lastly, in verse 28, we see Jesus gives us one more statement here. He says, "Truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." Right here, Jesus is telling his disciples that the kingdom is coming. The kingdom is coming, and Jesus will be victorious. Right? The road to surrender is going somewhere, and it's worth it. It will cost you something, but it is worth it. And the sacrifice that you make, it's not meaningless. Jesus said, "Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me." He is reminding them to trust in him, that he knows where the road is leading. And so my final point this morning is to trust where his way leads. We need to trust where his way leads. Following Jesus requires our faith because we don't always know where he's taking us, right? You don't know everything that God is going to do in your life. You start out on a journey and you have no idea how it will end, but you feel like you're faithfully just supposed to walk in it. We don't know every answer, but we do know the person that orders every step. We know who we are following. We're following the one who is faithful. And that's really what our faith looks like to be lived out. At this time, I'm going to invite the band to come back up. And as we begin to close this morning, as we begin to wrap up this series, right, we've talked about what it looks like to live the way of Jesus. Again, week one, it was all about to sit at the feet of Jesus just like Mary did, to be with him. Week two was to learn the rhythms of Jesus, for our lives to look like Jesus' life, the way he established rhythms of rest. It was all about resting with him. The third week was let's people see Jesus in you, right? Let people see Jesus in you because you've spent time with him. We're to become like him. Last week, again, we talked about community because we're not meant to follow him alone. And now Jesus is bringing it all together really with the heart of discipleship. And that's simply to follow him. It's simply to follow him. But following Jesus, it requires a decision. His way or my way. His plan or my plan. His timing or my timing. His capital K kingdom or my lowercase k kingdom. Following Jesus requires a decision. And if you're here today and you've never placed your faith and trust into Jesus, I just want to encourage you, there's no better time than now to simply surrender to him. We're all called to surrender something today, and I encourage you to surrender your life to Jesus if you've never done so. Jesus came to earth, lived as a man, died the death in our place, was buried, and he rose again on the third day victorious for you and for me. And I just want to say today is the day of salvation and to put your faith and trust in Jesus if you've never done so. And so to close, Jesus says, deny yourself. He says to take up your cross and to follow him. And that's ultimately what it means to live the way of Jesus. Would you pray with me? Father, thank you so much for the sacrifice of your Son, Jesus. Thank you that he is not some far-off king that we don't have access to. Thank you that he paid the penalty and the price for us that we could never pay. Thank you for his atonement. And thank you for what that means for us. Thank you for making a way for us to follow Jesus. Father, I pray for any things or any areas in our hearts that we're saying, hey, Jesus, we will follow you everywhere except blank. And I just want to give some time and space this morning to pray about that. In your own heart, just ask, is there any area in your life that you're not surrendering over to him? Jesus, help us surrender those things to you. We don't want to leave today carrying in what we brought in. We want to leave free. So Lord, we release those things to you. Holy Spirit, would you be in our time as we have the opportunity to respond to this message this morning? God, I pray that this word would go forth in your body, that it would take deep root in our hearts and in our minds. And Lord, would we just simply follow you? The invitation here is to follow you. And so, Father, I pray that we would be obedient to that call. I pray all of this in the name of Jesus. Amen.